Let me be direct with you. Benjamin Netanyahu has defeated nobody. Not one person. Not one enemy. Not one objective. After everything. After Gaza. After Lebanon. After Syria. After Iran. After all the airstrikes and the assassinations and the pager operations and the ground incursions and the declarations of victory, he has defeated absolutely nobody. And that is the single most important military and political truth of this entire catastrophic period. Strip away the propaganda, ignore the headlines, set aside the spin coming out of Tel Aviv and the carefully managed briefings flowing into Washington newsrooms. What you are left with when you remove all of that noise is a man who gambled everything on a losing hand and lost. A leader who expanded a war he could not win in order to survive politically at home. A man who sacrificed his country's military strength, its economic stability, its regional relationships, and its international standing on the altar of his own personal survival. And now, with nowhere left to turn and no more cards to play, with the walls closing in from every direction simultaneously, his last gambit has failed. It is over. I want you to understand how we arrived here, because this did not happen overnight, and it was not inevitable in the way that people now pretend it was obviously going to unfold. It has a logic. It has a sequence. It follows a pattern that anyone with a serious grounding in military history and political analysis could trace from the beginning, if they were willing to be honest about what they were seeing. And it begins, as almost everything in this saga begins, with October 7th. That investigation has not been completed. The full accounting has not been done. But when it is, and it will be, because the truth of these things always surfaces eventually, Benjamin Netanyahu's political career will be finished permanently and irreversibly. Because what that investigation will reveal, what the documents and the testimony and the intelligence records will show, is that his failures as a leader, his willful blindness, his obsessive prioritization of personal political survival over the actual security of the state he was supposed to be governing, created the precise conditions under which October 7th became possible. He was warned by his own intelligence services. The threat picture was available, and the reason he was distracted, the reason his government was consumed by entirely other priorities in the weeks and months before the catastrophe, is because he was in the middle of one of the most audacious and unprecedented power grabs in Israeli democratic history. An attempt to rewrite fundamental Israeli law so that he personally would be placed beyond the reach of prosecution. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis were already in the streets demanding his resignation, not after October 7th, before it, before a single rocket crossed the border. They were in the streets because their prime minister, facing serious and credible corruption charges that could send him to prison, was attempting to restructure the legal architecture of the state to protect himself from accountability. That is the man who was leading Israel when the catastrophe came. That is the context in which October 7th happened. And so what do you do when you are a man like that? When you are a man whose political survival depends entirely on never being held accountable, never facing the reckoning, never standing in a courtroom and answering for what you have done? You expand, you escalate, you manufacture the appearance of victory because the alternative is facing the music. And facing the music means the end of everything. You take a localized conflict and you transform it into a regional war. You drag your most powerful ally into engagements that serve your domestic political interests, while bleeding their treasury, their credibility, and their military resources. You kill Hassan Nasrallah, which is genuinely significant, and you make sure the cameras are rolling. You blow up the pagers in an operation that is, from a pure intelligence standpoint, genuinely impressive. You make moves into Syria, and at each step you present it to your domestic audience and to the world as evidence of strength, as proof that you are winning, as justification for why the war must continue and why you must remain in charge of it. But here is the problem. None of it solved anything. The domestic political catastrophe waiting for him at home did not disappear because of an operation in Lebanon. The corruption charges did not evaporate because of a strike on a Hezbollah commander. The hundreds of thousands of Israelis who had been in the streets did not go home satisfied because of military action in Syria. The fundamental equation remained unchanged. Benjamin Netanyahu faces prison if he loses power, and so he must never lose power. And the only way to stay in power is to keep the country in a state of permanent crisis, in which his removal seems too dangerous to contemplate. This is what a Ponzi scheme looks like when it is translated into geopolitical strategy. You keep feeding it or it collapses. Every new escalation must be larger than the last. Every claimed victory must be more dramatic. Every manufactured crisis must be more urgent. Because the moment you stop, the moment there is a pause long enough for people to look around and assess honestly, the whole structure is exposed. And Netanyahu kept feeding it month after month, expansion after expansion. But a Ponzi scheme cannot go on forever. At some point, the obligations outrun the resources. At some point, the new investments can no longer cover the losses of the old ones. And at some point, and we have now definitively reached that point, there is nowhere left to go. The final expansion was Iran, and I want to be absolutely unambiguous about something that I think is being insufficiently stated in the public discourse. Israel would never have struck Iran at the scope and scale that we witnessed without direct, substantial, and knowing American involvement. Never. That operation required American military infrastructure. It required American basing rights. It required American intelligence collection and sharing. It required American logistical support and American political cover at the international level. It required someone sitting in a position of authority in Washington who would receive the arguments being advanced by Netanyahu's government, evaluate them, apparently accept them without sufficient skepticism, and authorize American participation in what was fundamentally at its core a war being fought to extend one man's political viability in a country facing domestic collapse. And that is precisely what happened. The result was not the swift, decisive victory that had been promised. The result was a humiliation of historic and strategic proportions. Because here is what the world now knows about that exchange, and what no amount of official silence or managed press coverage can erase. Iran took out the totality of American military infrastructure in the Gulf Arab states. The bases, the equipment, the operational capacity that we had positioned in that region, infrastructure that represented decades of investment and that formed the foundation of American power projection in that theater, was struck effectively and comprehensively, and the red, white, and blue shield that the United States had told itself and told the world could absorb any strike, could protect any partner, could deter any adversary who might be tempted to challenge American dominance in the region, turned out to be fictional. We went to war against ourselves. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it is not a rhetorical flourish. When you launch a major military operation and the primary casualty is your own infrastructure, your own equipment, your own operational credibility, you have, in the most literal strategic sense, gone to war against yourself. Operation Freedom Sentinel, or whatever name was attached to it, proved with devastating finality that the United States cannot project meaningful military power into that theater. We are in that region impotent, and now every government in the world knows it. China knows it with particular interest. Russia has noted it carefully. Every adversary and every potential adversary has updated their calculations accordingly. Israel, meanwhile, sustained significant damage, more than is being publicly acknowledged, and far more than the Israeli government is willing to admit. The Israeli military knows this. The commanders and the intelligence professionals who were present for that exchange know precisely what the weapons that struck American bases were capable of doing, and know what those same weapons did to Israeli territory and Israeli military infrastructure. You cannot hide battlefield reality from the people who experienced it. You can manage press coverage. You can control official statements. But the soldiers and the officers who were there know what happened, and that knowledge will spread. And now Israel finds itself in a strategic trap with no visible exit. Hezbollah, which Netanyahu told his people and told the world had been decisively defeated, is not defeated. They are still there. They are still fighting. They are still capable. The war in Lebanon that was supposed to be a decisive chapter has become a permanent, grinding, resource-consuming forever war with no end date and no clear objective. Gaza can reignite at any moment. The underlying conditions have not been resolved. The underlying grievances have not been addressed, and the population has not been pacified. It has been devastated, which is a very different thing. Syria is not stabilized. It is chaotic in ways that create ongoing security problems rather than resolving them. And through his extraordinary mismanagement of regional relationships, Netanyahu has helped generate a potential new confrontation with Turkey, a NATO member, which, if it develops into actual armed conflict, would represent a level of strategic insanity that is almost difficult to comprehend. Israel, a country of 9 million people with a deteriorating economy and an exhausted military, picking a fight with a NATO member and the second largest military force in the Atlantic Alliance. The economics of this situation deserve serious attention because they are in many ways the most decisive factor in how this ends. Israel's economy is in serious and worsening trouble. That is not speculation. It is not political commentary. It is a statement of observable fact. The war has been fiscally devastating. The Abraham Accords, which were presented as a transformational diplomatic achievement that would open a new era of regional economic integration and give Israel access to Gulf Arab capital and markets, are under severe strain. The United Arab Emirates, the centerpiece partner in that framework, is itself navigating serious economic difficulty, withdrawing from OPEC to flood the market with oil production, recalling a major loan it had extended to Pakistan, making the kinds of rapid and reactive financial moves that speak to institutional desperation rather than confident strategic management. With the Strait of Hormuz compromised, even the free movement of energy resources that would underpin economic recovery is not guaranteed. The entire financial and economic architecture that was supposed to underwrite Israeli regional ambition has developed deep structural cracks, and as economic conditions deteriorate, as the costs of the war continue to compound, as investment flees and growth contracts, you will see depopulation begin. I am saying this plainly. As life in Israel becomes economically and physically untenable for significant portions of the population, people will leave. They will exercise the option of returning to the countries from which they or their families came. And when depopulation reaches sufficient scale, the entire demographic premise of the Zionist project, the maintenance of a clear Jewish demographic majority in a defined territory, becomes mathematically unsustainable. Now, a reasonable question is, why wouldn't Iran simply press its advantage at this point? Why wouldn't they push hard when Netanyahu is already cornered and his country is already on a trajectory of decline? And my answer to that, which I hold with genuine conviction, is that pressing that advantage would be a strategic mistake, not because Iran lacks the capability, and not because the moral or legal case for pressure is absent. It is not, but because it is unnecessary, and because pressing too hard creates risks that patience avoids entirely. Netanyahu, stripped of options, is dangerous in a specific and particular way. He is a narcissist who is staring at the end of his political career, the end of his freedom, and potentially the end of everything he has built over decades of political maneuvering. A man in that position, backed into a corner with nothing left to lose, is capable of irrational and catastrophic decisions, not because those decisions serve any strategic logic, but because they serve the psychology of a man who cannot accept defeat. If you give him a crisis large enough to rally Israeli public opinion around the flag and around his leadership, even temporarily, you give him a lifeline he does not deserve and has not earned. So the wise course, and I believe Iranian strategic thinking understands this, is patience. Get out of the way. Let the internal contradictions do their work. Israel is collapsing under its own weight. That process is underway. You do not need to accelerate it with actions that carry their own risks and complications. Sometimes the greatest strategic wisdom is simply to recognize when your adversary is destroying himself and refrain from interrupting him. On the transformation of American foreign policy, I think the picture becomes clearer when you understand what Donald Trump actually is and how he operates. He is, before anything else, a political survivor with an acute and unsentimental sense of his own interests. During the election cycle, he needed Miriam Adelson's financial support. He accepted it. He staffed his national security apparatus with people she approved of, most prominently Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, a position she had originally wanted him to occupy as vice president. And that team, that carefully assembled, ideologically committed team, led Donald Trump into the single most damaging foreign policy catastrophe of his presidency. They presented him with assessments that turned out to be wrong. They gave him confidence in an operation that failed comprehensively. They made him look weak, which is, for a man of Trump's particular psychology and brand, arguably the worst thing that can be done to him. The people who make Donald Trump look weak do not remain in his circle. That is one of the few absolutely consistent rules of his political behavior. Pete Hegseth's time as Secretary of Defense is effectively over, though the formal removal has not yet happened. His performance before the United States Senate was an embarrassment that no serious country should tolerate from a cabinet officer. The arrogance, the combativeness, the stunning absence of intellectual substance. A Secretary of Defense works for the American people and owes the United States Senate honest, respectful, and competent engagement. What was on display was none of those things. He will be removed, and the failure of this war will be formally assigned to him as part of the political management of the aftermath. Marco Rubio's situation is more nuanced. The combination of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor in a single person was always an arrangement that concentrated too much ideological commitment in a single decision node, and that concentration contributed to the strategic groupthink that produced this disaster. Separating those roles, installing genuinely independent thinking at the National Security Council would be a rational and necessary correction. Scott Bessent, meanwhile, has managed the remarkable achievement of simultaneously damaging the economic relationship with China while presiding over domestic economic conditions that are making ordinary Americans feel the consequences of these foreign policy misadventures in their daily lives. His position is untenable. Remove those figures. Replace them with people who do not come to the table with a prior ideological commitment to the proposition that American power should be permanently deployed in service of Israeli strategic ambitions. And you will find that American foreign policy realigns with American interests with relatively little difficulty, because the underlying American interest, economic stability, avoiding costly foreign wars, maintaining relationships with major trading partners, is not actually served by the current posture. The politics are moving in exactly this direction. 60% of the American public now views Israel negatively. Nearly the same proportion views Netanyahu as a destructive force in the region and in the American relationship. These numbers would have been genuinely shocking 5 years ago. Today they represent the new baseline, and they will continue to move in the same direction as the economic consequences of this war continue to compound. The American people are not, I have to be honest about this, responding primarily to moral arguments about international law or the rights of civilian populations. They are responding to what it costs them at the gas pump. They are responding to what it does to their grocery bills and their retirement accounts. Bill Clinton understood this precisely. It is the economy. That is what drives American political behavior at the mass level, and right now in ways that are direct and measurable and personal. The Israeli relationship is costing the American people money. That is a political force that no amount of lobbying or media management can indefinitely contain. I want to say something about Iran's future, because I think it matters and because I think the strategic choice before Iranian leadership is genuinely consequential. The future of Iran is not in military confrontation, though Iran has now demonstrated that it can fight and that the military capabilities that others long dismissed are very real. The future of Iran is in a decisive, committed, and permanent pivot toward the East. The relationship with Russia and China, nations that have been honest with Iran, that have kept their commitments, that have not signed agreements, and then walked away from them for domestic political convenience the way the United States has done not once but repeatedly. That relationship is the genuine foundation of Iran's economic and political future. Integration into the BRICS economic framework, deep and structural connectivity with Asian markets and Asian capital, a posture that makes Iran so thoroughly embedded in the Eastern economic system that no future American administration, regardless of its ideological complexion, can extract Iran from that network through sanctions. That is a good future. That is a prosperous future. And the sooner Iranian leadership, which I know still contains a significant element that hopes for eventual rapprochement with the West, accepts the honest assessment that the West, meaning the the United States and Europe as they currently exist and as they are currently governed, is not a reliable partner, the sooner Iran can build the future it actually deserves. The sanctions architecture will be dismantled, not because Washington has decided to be generous, but because the alternative is being choked off economically in ways the United States cannot sustain. Iran has the advantage. China has already demonstrated that American secondary sanctions enforcement is a paper threat. They have told Washington directly that sanctioning Chinese entities for doing business with Iran will be treated as an act of economic war and will be reciprocated in kind. The Russians and the Chinese have made clear through every available channel that comprehensive peace requires comprehensive sanctions relief. The international sanctions at the UN Security Council level will not be reimposed because Russia and China hold vetoes and will use them. The path is clear. It will be difficult politically inside the American system with congressional resistance and partisan maneuvering, but the direction is not in doubt. What we are watching, and I want to be precise about this because precision matters when you are describing genuinely historical developments, is the end of an empire. The American empire was constructed on a single foundational capability, the control of the seas, blue water naval dominance, the ability to put American military force anywhere in the world within a relatively short time, to be present at every strategic choke point, to make every government that might consider challenging American interests understand that the consequences of doing so would be swift, powerful, and decisive. That era is ending. The South China Sea is effectively under Chinese strategic control. The Gulf is now a contested space in ways it simply was not before. American carrier groups, which were the physical embodiment of American power projection, now face anti-ship missile systems and drone saturation tactics that make their deployment in contested waters a very different calculation than it was 15 years ago. Every operation we have conducted in recent years has widened the gap between the mythology of American military omnipotence and the reality of what American forces can actually accomplish against a sophisticated and determined adversary. This is not easy to say. I wore this country's uniform. I believe in the men and women who serve and who have always served with extraordinary dedication and professionalism. But institutional honesty requires acknowledging when strategy has failed, when capability has been overstated, and when the gap between what we claim to be able to do and what we can actually do has become dangerously wide. That gap is now visible to the entire world. China has seen it. Russia cataloged it carefully long before this most recent demonstration. Iran just proved it on a global stage in a single military exchange that will be studied in staff colleges and war colleges for decades. Netanyahu gambled that he could pull the United States into one final decisive campaign. He gambled that American power would overwhelm Iranian resistance, that the operation would be swift and successful, that the outcome would validate his years of escalation, salvage his political career, defer his legal reckoning indefinitely, and cement a legacy of Israeli military supremacy in the region. He lost that bet. He lost it completely and without any significant mitigation. He has no more bets to make. The Gambit was the last one, and when the full truth of October 7th is finally examined under proper legal and political scrutiny, when the intelligence records are opened and the testimony is taken, and the decisions of the days and weeks and months before that catastrophe are traced back to their origins, it will become clear that the thread runs directly and without interruption from his personal political survival calculations to the failures that made October 7th possible, to the escalatory war that followed, to the regional catastrophe that now defines his legacy. Israel lost this war. Not a battle, not a phase, not a campaign, the war, the entire strategic gambit, and Netanyahu, who designed it, who expanded it, who dragged the United States into it and burned through American military credibility in the process, will not survive its aftermath. Sometimes the only winning move is to get out of the way and let collapse run its course. The collapse is already in motion. It was set in motion by the decisions of one man trying to survive one political crisis, and it has built momentum that no new escalation, no new gambit, and no new claim of imminent victory will now be able to arrest.